Nissan has been testing the market for a ute with a bit more, and now the Japanese car maker has taken it to the extreme with this, the Navara N-Trek Warrior. At the front, we've got a steel bull bar, so nice and tough. It also extends the length of the car. Of course, a LED light bar on the front, and underneath, some pretty solid underbody protection. So you're looking at stainless steel, 3mm thick stainless steel, to really try and bash away anything you might come up against. So some pretty tough stuff going on there too. Now all that extra kit has added weight. You're looking at about 193 kilos, and of course that comes off the payload. No biggie there, still a pretty tough truck in terms of what it'll carry. There's also some things missing though, things like a snorkel. Nissan basically decided to leave that to the aftermarket. If you want those extras, go and get them from someone else. They're focused on the more popular things. The engine, untouched, we'll get onto that in a bit more detail later on, and things like side steps. Now, if you're really going to get rugged, obviously they are going to come a cropper pretty early, but thankfully you've got a bit of extra ride height there to keep them a little bit out of harm's way. And there is a great Aussie story to it, a big hit of Australian DNA. That's because the engineering work was all done here on Australian roads. The mob behind it all is an outfit called Premcar. They're better known for working on V8 powered Ford Falcons, but in this case they've turned their attention, their engineering nous, to a car that's all about off-road capability. We've headed to the Victorian High Country to give the Warrior a thorough workout. The first thing you notice is that stance, having those wheels spaced further apart, just gives it a more planted feel on the road, and there's better control generally, better body control over bumps and particularly through corners that give you that extra confidence. Not quite as good maybe are the tyres sitting on Cooper rubber, which is better suited to the rough stuff. It's not as good on road, so you're going to get it squealing and so on a bit earlier, but once you get into terrain like this, that's where they take over. But there's also plenty going on with the entire suspension system. The engineers have actually softened off the springs, made the dampers work a bit harder, put unique dampers in there, and also brought the bump stops into the equation. So they say that the bump stops come into play pretty early on, so you're actually using them and they've got some progressiveness to the way they play a role. So instead of jarring or bouncing off them and having this enormous rebound, it's actually far better controlled. You can't actually tell that it's using those rebounds. And of course you've got all the regular Navara hardware working with you. So dual range transfer case, bung it into four-wheel drive and you're going to lock that centre diff. You've also got a separate rear diff lock, so plenty of traction going on. Combined with these tyres, this thing climbs out of some pretty serious stuff. But where the Warrior really steps up is once you step up the pace. That's when you get the suspension really working, really sort of helping to control those big hits. And it does a really nice job. Once you're sort of touring and cruising over rougher roads like this, it's just really coping with it nicely, settling quickly and not getting out of shape. It's also the detail work that's gone into it. So Nissan hasn't gone cutting any corners, so a good example of that is that spare tyre at the back. It's exactly the same as the other four tyres on the car, and it required some pretty significant engineering work to the rear tow bar, so they had to redesign that entire unit. One thing that hasn't changed is the engine. Very familiar 2.3 litre, 4-cylinder twin turbo engine, so 140 kilowatts of power, decent grunt, 450 newton meters. It pulls strongly. One of its strengths is fuel efficiency, so you can go a decent distance before having to refuel. But it's also working a bit harder here. We've got the extra weight, almost 200 kilos, and of course the gearing has changed because of those larger tyres, so about 7% different once you pop it into first gear, low range, let it crawl down a hill, and you really don't need the hill descent control system. It does a pretty nice job on its own. Now of course Ford's Ranger Raptor has proven just how popular these big beefed up utes can be, and it's the obvious yardstick to compare this thing with. Keep in mind the Navara N-Trek Warrior is significantly cheaper. You're looking at sort of 10 to 15 grand depending on what sort of deals you're comparing it on. So it's a much more affordable ute. It's also not as good, so the Raptor is a better thing generally. The Warrior, it's not quite there, but it is still a really capable truck, a really capable off-roader, and certainly steps things up massively for the Navara. Obviously looks at business as well, so that's a bonus, but a worthwhile addition to the off-road range.